French government spending is out of control. It takes up 57% of GDP, a record surpassed only by Ukraine, which is in the middle of a devastating war. Even worse, France spends far more than it brings in, running deficits every single year without a break for more than 50 years. That whole is financed with debt that has reached 3.4 trillion euros. In other words, every French citizen owes about 50,000 euros. That is why in September 2025, Prime Minister François Bayrou proposed making an adjustment to fix the state's accounts. And then this happened. More than 200,000 people took to the streets under the slogan, "Block Everything." Coordinated strikes, trains stopped, refineries shut down. In a matter of days, what was once a budget became a political war, and Bayrou ended up being removed by parliament. Even though the adjustment he proposed was simply going from this to this. We are not talking about dismantling the welfare state, but a minimal adjustment to avoid its collapse. But that doesn't matter, because in France, spending is untouchable. What's at stake is not just numbers, but part of the national identity. A model of state that was born in 1945 as the foundation of the modern republic. In 1945, after the Second World War, France was in ruins. Millions of French people had lost family members, their homes, and their jobs. It was necessary to rebuild not only cities and factories, but also trust in institutions, which had been destroyed. In that context, France understood that the only way to recover was by uniting the country, leaving no one behind. And it did so with a set of decrees in October 1945. Their spirit was to guarantee all citizens access to healthcare, pensions, protection against unemployment, and social benefits, no matter their profession or where they lived. It was the creation of French social security, the embryo of the modern welfare state. For the first time in the country's history, Republican fraternity, that third principle that had always been secondary to liberty and equality, was turned into a legal obligation. It was no longer an abstract ideal, but an enforceable right. The state assumed it had a duty to protect all its citizens. But the most extraordinary part was not its creation, but that in a country marked by political division, it was one of the few moments when ideological borders disappeared. For the left, it was a historic triumph that represented the long-promised social justice, while also aiming to prevent poverty and despair from opening the door to fascism again. But the surprise came from the other side, when Christian Democrats and conservatives also supported the system's creation. It was a guarantee of national unity and cohesion, a way to reconcile French people from very different worlds, workers and peasants, or resistors and collaborators. That broad consensus turned welfare into a pillar of Republican identity, a symbol so deep for the French that questioning it feels like an attack on the nation. That's why, while in many other countries, protesting in the streets is seen as defending privileges, in France, it is seen as defending the foundations of the Republic. However, even though the French welfare state was born with broad consensus, it also had a weakness in its design. It was not built on general taxes like VAT or income tax, but financed mainly through payroll contributions. It was a design that worked perfectly in a country with full employment. As long as everyone worked, contributions came in regularly and the system expanded with every paycheck. But all it took was for employment to contract, or for the population to age and many to stop working, for the system to begin failing. Despite this, that fragility remained hidden for decades thanks to an unprecedented economic boom. Between 1945 and 1973, France experienced what many historians call its 30 glorious years. It was a period of growth that today seems almost unreal. The economy grew at about 5% a year, unemployment was only 2%, and millions of French people felt that each year they lived better than the last. The state applied a model known as dirigism. It was a very particular type of capitalism in which the market existed, but the state planned and guided its direction. Strategic sectors of industry, energy, transport, and banking were nationalized. And those public banks began channeling national savings into sectors the state considered strategic, like automobiles, chemicals, or aerospace. Even agriculture was protected, shielding French farmers from foreign competition. This dirigism allowed France to catch up technologically with the United States and Germany. During those years, Airbus, Renault, and the nuclear sector began to symbolize a France that combined industrial sovereignty with modernization. At the same time, the welfare state kept expanding. Every year meant more pensions, more family subsidies, and more healthcare coverage. And the base was solid because there was full employment and rapid growth feeding the contributions that financed the system. During this time, France seemed to have found the perfect balance between capitalism and socialism. It planned without suffocating innovation, and it protected without destroying private initiative. But this model had a weak point. Almost every productive sector needed cheap, abundant energy, and France depended on imported oil for 2/3 of its supply. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War and the Arab oil embargo made oil prices quadruple in just months. And the collapse was immediate. Inflation jumped to 14% in 1974, economic growth crashed, and in 1975, GDP was negative for the first time in 30 years. Unemployment stopped being a marginal 2%, and from then on became structural around 10%. France faced a hard problem. It had to maintain a huge welfare state funded by payroll taxes at the same time unemployment became structural. At that moment, France decided to finance it with debt, and from then on, it never had a budget surplus again. Year after year, for the next 50 years, the French state spent more than it collected, as the expansion of the welfare state never stopped. In 1982, François Mitterrand lowered the retirement age from 65 to 60, which was celebrated as a historic victory for workers and as a symbol of leftist power. There were more retirees, fewer contributors, and growing spending the state could not cover with real income, only with more debt. At the same time, the government multiplied bailouts of crisis-hit industries like steel, cars, and airlines. Companies were nationalized, jobs were protected, and every bailout was paid for with public money. The state acted as a guarantor of everything. By 1996, runaway public spending had created public debt equal to 60% of GDP, and then the Social Debt Repayment Fund was created. It was the clearest acknowledgement that deficits were no longer temporary, but chronic. In theory, this was a temporary mechanism, a special fund where Social Security shortfalls would be transferred to be paid off slowly with a new tax. In practice, what was supposed to last 10 or 15 years was extended repeatedly, and today it still exists, with hundreds of billions still pending repayment. France understood its system was unsustainable, but instead of fixing it, it created a social mortgage to be paid by future generations. The question is, why? Why didn't it seek a permanent solution to such a serious problem, and instead chose to push it forward, even if that meant mortgaging the country's future? The problem is that in France, proposing reforms that cut the welfare state is almost like declaring war. French unions have enormous power, but not because they have millions of members, since their unionization rate is barely 8%, one of the lowest in Europe. Their strength does not lie in numbers, but in their strategic control over key sectors. A teacher strike is disruptive, but a refinery strike leaves the country without fuel in just days. A railway strike can paralyze national mobility, and a blockade at the ports means France cannot import or export. It does not take everyone marching in the streets, only one crucial sector stopping to force the whole country to negotiate. French strikes are not labor protests. They're a political weapon that redefines the state's ability to govern. 3 recent examples show this with clarity. In 2010, Nicolas Sarkozy tried to raise the retirement age from 60 to 62. It seemed like an inevitable, almost technical change. But the country went up in flames with strikes, marches, and refinery blockades. The reform was passed, yes, but at the cost of huge political damage that left the presidency weakened and legitimacy eroded. In 2019, Emmanuel Macron faced the railway system. His plan to reform the privileged statutes of railway workers triggered weeks of paralysis in national transport. The protests did not stop the reform completely, but they made every step more costly and forced the government to negotiate under constant pressure. And in 2023 came the climax with the pension reform to once again raise the retirement age, this time from 62 to 64. Macron decided to approve the reform without a final parliamentary vote, using Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, and the fracture was total. Millions of French people took to the streets in massive protests. Mountains of trash piled up uncollected in Paris, and violence erupted in clashes with the police. For many French citizens, Macron was no longer their president, but the face of a state imposing itself against the people's will. It was a very heavy blow to the government's legitimacy. Each of these battles made clear that in France, the political cost of reform can be so high that legal victory feels like political defeat. And there lies the heart of the dilemma. What happens when the state can no longer pay its bills, but the political cost prevents it from carrying out the needed reforms? What happens is that after half a century of postponing reforms and paying for spending with more debt, the situation has become unsustainable. Public debt already exceeds 3.4 trillion euros, the equivalent of 115% of GDP, the third highest in the Eurozone after Greece and Italy. Meanwhile, the fiscal deficit, the gap between what the state collects and what it spends, was 5.8% in 2024. These are figures far above the limits set by the European Union's Stability and Growth Pact, which requires keeping public deficit under 3% of GDP and debt around 60%. The most visible consequence is what France pays in interest on debt, which is about 2.3% of GDP, more than it spends on national defense. In other words, France finances two armies, one to protect its borders and another invisible one made up of creditors who collect punctually every year. And the most delicate part is that debt must be constantly refinanced. Every year, about 200 billion euros in bonds mature and must be renewed in the markets. For years, the French treasury was able to borrow at rates near zero, but new issues now pay rates around 3.5%, and every renewal becomes a new hit to the budget. It is shocking to see that France, the second largest economy in the European Union, pays higher interests than Greece. A country that was on the verge of bankruptcy in 2010 and became a synonym for crisis, today manages to finance itself with more confidence from the markets than France. As if all this were not enough, there is something beyond fiscal deficit, endless debt, and the huge cost of paying interest. The worst part is that every year, the base that supports the system gets smaller. Because if debt shows yesterday's bill, demographics show tomorrow's, and France faces a collapse in birth rates. The country that in the 2000s was seen as the European exception for keeping fertility rates close to replacement level has now fallen to a historic low of 1.62 children per woman. Every year, tens of thousands fewer French children are born, and the dependency ratio, the balance between retirees and active workers, leans more toward retirees. It is a system that cannot sustain itself, and it cannot be solved by immigration either, as some argue. Today, about 13% of the French population was born abroad, one of the highest numbers in Europe. In theory, this should ease the pressure, since more young people could contribute to the system. But the reality is less simple. Immigration only helps if labor integration is fast and massive. In France, integration has been slow and uneven, which makes the net fiscal impact limited, close to zero. In other words, immigrants are not the solution. So, with 3.4 trillion euros in debt, a deficit near 6%, birth rates at historic lows, and rising interest rates, by the end of 2024, the situation had become unsustainable. And the cost was paid by politics. On December 4, 2024, Prime Minister Michel Barnier fell to a no-confidence vote in Parliament. It was not for a lost war, not for a corruption scandal, but for something that should, in theory, be routine: a budget. Barnier had proposed an adjustment to contain the deficit and slow down debt growth by freezing some benefits, stopping certain public spending, and limiting wage increases in the state sector. The measures were unpopular, yes, but nothing radical compared to what markets demanded. Still, they were enough for the National Assembly to bring him down with a no-confidence motion. To make matters worse, a few months later, the story repeated itself with his successor. In September 2025, the new Prime Minister, centrist François Bayrou, proposed freezing salaries and pensions, eliminating 2 public holidays, and halting increases in the public sector. But as we already know, in France, touching the core of the social state is something existential. On September 8, 2025, Bayrou also fell to a no-confidence motion in the National Assembly. The second time in just 9 months, after more than 6 decades without similar precedents. In France, uncontrolled deficits or unpayable debt do not bring down governments. Protests in the street do. And in this way, the inability to reform the system becomes structural. The problem of France is not the welfare state itself, but its design. If someone wanted to prove that a generous welfare state can be sustainable, the example lies in the north. Sweden, Denmark, or Finland are countries where social benefits are as high as those in France, but their budgets do not collapse every year. The key is in the tax base. The Nordic countries built a system where everyone pays, with taxes on consumption, income, and property. Revenue is collected broadly and steadily, which makes it possible to support spending without relying on a single pillar. France, on the other hand, chose to place a disproportionate burden on workers. According to a 2024 study by the Institut Économique Molinari, an average French worker pays 54% of their salary in taxes, while in Sweden they pay 46%, in Denmark 41%, and in Finland 45%. Despite this, the French state collects less, because a large part of society, unemployed people, retirees, and many self-employed with reduced contributions, contribute far less than workers. The problem is that nobody wants to pay more or see their benefits reduced. And the streets show it with every protest, while Parliament confirms it with every no-confidence vote against a prime minister. Because France's problem is not only economic and social, it's also political. In almost any other country, an unpopular reform can pass if the government has a parliamentary majority. In France, it cannot. Since 2022, no political bloc has a clear majority, and every law is a trench war. The president has a legal tool, the famous Article 49.3, which allows him to pass laws without a vote, but using it is like lighting a match in a refinery, since the public sees it as an attack on democracy and responds with massive protests. The truth is that France does not need a smaller state, but a more efficient one with a broader base of financing. The only real way out is a major political and social pact. An agreement that combines three things: improving the efficiency of spending, spreading the tax burden more fairly so it does not fall disproportionately on workers, and making gradual changes in pensions and other benefits. It is not about destroying the welfare state, but about saving it. But who dares to do that in a country where every attempt at reform topples governments? At the core, France is not just debating numbers or the design of a system, it is debating who it is. The French welfare state was born as a pact of national unity, a shield against misery and extremism that had destroyed the Republic. And that welfare state became part of its national identity. 80 years later, that fraternity runs head-on into three unstoppable forces: globalization that exposes the economy to the toughest competition, demographics that shrink the base of contributors, and financial markets that no longer lend without asking questions. Between a society that defends solidarity as a sacred right and a reality that has become unsustainable, France must figure out how to hold on to its identity without breaking its economy. Something that, as we can see, is anything but simple. That is the end of today's video. If you liked it, don't forget to watch the next one.